Welcome back to The Remote Islander, your go-to podcast for all things remote work in the Caribbean and Latin America. In previous episodes of the podcast, we've spoken about Virus Dev and Work Better Now, two companies that have been genuine entry points for professionals in our region into the global remote work economy, like myself. And those conversations have resonated. But the most common follow-up question I get from listeners is some version of, okay, I know about those two, but are there others out there? Over the last two episodes, we covered strategy with Oshido Christie and the full landscape of job boards. And if Oshido's episode lit something up for you, if you walked away thinking, okay, I'm ready to take this seriously, then this episode is your next step. Today, we're going one level deeper. 7 specific companies that are genuinely worth your time and energy as a remote work professional. And I want to be clear about how I curated this. These are not just companies that allow remote work. These are companies where remote is the foundation, where their entire culture, communication, infrastructure, and hiring approach has been built around distributed teams from the ground up. That distinction matters enormously for Caribbean and Latin American professionals, because a company that reluctantly permits remote work will treat you differently than a company that was built for it. I've also filtered specifically for companies that hire globally without rigid geographic restrictions. No US only, no must be based in Europe. These are companies where being in Port of Spain or Kingston or Medellin isn't a disqualifier. It's just a location on a distributed map. For each company, I'm going to tell you what they do, what kind of talent they hire, what makes them worth your time, and what you should know going in. The world is hiring. Let's get you ready. Let's start with one of the most respected names in remote work, and one that doesn't get nearly enough attention in Caribbean and LatAm professional communities. Automattic is the company behind WordPress.com, WooCommerce, Tumblr, and a suite of other tools that power a significant portion of the global internet. They have over 1,700 employees spread across more than 90 countries. Not 90 cities, 90 countries. This is a company where distributed work isn't a policy, it's the founding architecture. One thing worth being transparent about, Automattic went through a turbulent period in 2024 and early 2025. In April 2025, the company announced a restructuring that resulted in the layoff of 16% of its workforce, tied in part to a prolonged legal dispute with a competitor. That's real context you should have going in. It doesn't disqualify Automattic from this list. Their remote culture and global hiring model remain genuinely exceptional. But it means you should go in with eyes open, research current open roles carefully, and make sure the team you'd be joining is stable. What makes Automattic particularly interesting for our audience is the breadth of roles they hire for. Yes, there are engineering positions, but there are also roles in customer happiness, marketing, finance, legal, HR, and operations. They are not a pure tech shop. They hire generalists and specialists across functions, and they have a genuine commitment to finding talent regardless of geography. Their hiring process is worth knowing about because it's different from most. After an initial application and interview process, final candidates are given a paid trial project, a real piece of work, compensated, designed to show how you actually operate in a distributed environment. This is their way of evaluating culture fit and work style in a context that mirrors what the job actually looks like. If you make it to that stage, take it seriously. What to expect: flexible hours, an open vacation policy, annual company meetups, home office allowance, and a culture that values written communication above everything else. If you are a clear, structured writer, Automattic will reward that. Where to apply: automattic.com/workwithus. If Automattic is the gold standard for distributed work culture, GitLab is the gold standard for distributed work documentation. GitLab builds the DevSecOps platform used by engineers and development teams worldwide. But what makes them remarkable as an employer, beyond the product, is their public handbook. GitLab has documented in extraordinary detail how they hire, how they communicate, how they make decisions, how they evaluate performance, and how they run every aspect of the company. And that handbook is publicly available. And reading it before you apply is one of the best things you can do as a candidate. GitLab operates as an all-remote company with team members in more than 65 countries. They hire engineers, product managers, designers, sales professionals, and people in operations, legal, and marketing. Their commitment to asynchronous communication means that being in a different time zone is not a structural disadvantage. It's an expected and accommodated reality. For Caribbean and LATAM professionals in tech, developers, DevOps engineers, security professionals, product managers, GitLab is one of the most credible remote employers in the world. The standards are high, the process is rigorous, and the compensation reflects that. What to expect? Generous professional development budget, home office stipends, a strong async work model, and a company that genuinely invests in the documentation and infrastructure that makes distributed work function properly. Where to apply? gitlab.com/jobs. Now, Zapier is one of the most well-known remote-first companies in the world, and for good reason. They build no-code automation tools that help people connect apps and workflows without writing a single line of code, and they have been fully remote since their founding. As of 2025, their team spans more than 40 countries. What I want to highlight about this company specifically for this audience is the type of culture they've built. Zapier is explicitly results-oriented. They hire people who can manage their own time, communicate clearly in writing, and deliver outcomes without being managed hour by hour. That profile, self-dedicated, disciplined, outcome-focused, maps well onto the remote work ethos that we talk about on this show every single episode. Zapier recently expanded its AI product lineup significantly, which means they are hiring in areas that intersect directly with the AI wave we discussed in our last episode. If you have a background in automation, no-code development, product, marketing, or customer success, Zapier is worth a serious look. What to expect? Profit sharing, annual company retreats, home office and wellness budget, and a culture that genuinely protects deep work and discourages the performative busyness that plagues traditional office environments. Where to apply? Zapier.com/jobs. Now, here's one that I think is genuinely underutilized by Caribbean and LATAM professionals, and it shouldn't be. Superside is a creative as a service company. What that means is that they provide enterprise clients, major global brands with on-demand subscription-based access to a distributed team of designers, motion graphic specialists, video editors, copywriters, and creative strategists. Think of them as a fully remote creative agency operating at global scale. Here's why this matters for our region specifically. A significant portion of Superside's talent base is already in Latin America and parts of the Caribbean. Their model is explicitly built around accessing world-class creative talent in markets outside the US and Western Europe. If you're a designer, video editor, motion graphics artist, UX professional, or brand strategist, this is a company that is actively looking for people like you in regions like ours. Their Glassdoor reviews are instructive. One recurring theme from employees in developing countries is this: the pay is competitive precisely because Superside benchmarks globally and pays market rates that are significantly above local standards in the markets where they recruit. That's a value proposition for a Caribbean or LATAM creative professional in concrete terms. Their hiring process is thorough, but well-structured, and candidates consistently report clear communication throughout. What to expect? Fully remote positions across creative disciplines, a global academy for internal training and certification, mentorship, and a culture where the quality of your work determines your growth. Where to apply? careers.superside.com. This one is a little different, and I think it's one of the most mission-aligned companies on this list for the Caribbean and LATAM audience. SafetyWing was founded to solve a problem that every remote worker and digital nomad in our region knows intimately: the absence of portable, affordable health and income insurance for people who work across borders. They build global health insurance and remote health products specifically for distributed workers and the companies that employ them. Their entire business exists because the traditional social safety net was not built for the way we work now. And they practice what they preach. SafetyWing is a fully remote team of around 100 people distributed across 10 time zones and 6 continents. They operate with high trust and autonomy, minimal standing meetings, and a genuinely asynchronous first communication culture. They are a smaller company, which means roles open less frequently than at Automattic or GitLab. But when they do hire, they hire globally across product, engineering, marketing, operations, and customer success functions. If you work in any of those areas and you care about the mission of building infrastructure for the global remote economy, SafetyWing is worth following closely and applying to when the right role opens. What to expect? Flexibility on hours, global health coverage through their own products, and in-person team gatherings in destinations around the world. Where to apply? SafetyWing.com/careers. And speaking of companies whose product is the problem they're solving, Remote.com belongs on this list for reasons that go beyond just being a good employer. Remote.com builds employer of record infrastructure, and what that means in practice is that they allow companies to hire employees in countries where those companies don't have a legal entity, handling payroll, compliance, taxes, and benefits locally so the employer does not have to navigate it themselves. In 2025, they surpassed $100 million in annual recurring revenue and now operate in over 180 countries. Why does this matter for us? Because Remote.com is part of the infrastructure that makes it legally and practically possible for a company in San Francisco to hire someone in Barbados without setting up a local entity. Understanding how employer of record platforms work and which companies use them is genuinely useful knowledge for navigating the global hiring landscape. But beyond what they enable for others, Remote.com is a strong employer in its own right. Their team is fully distributed and they hire across HR, legal, finance, product, engineering, sales, and customer success. Their remote maturity score, a measure of how deeply remote work is embedded in a company's operations, ranks among the highest of any company their size. What to expect? International benefits, flexible hours, learning allowances, and a global career environment where the work you do is directly tied into making remote work more accessible for professionals everywhere, including in our region. Where to apply? Remote.com/careers. And I want to close this list with Buffer, because I think it represents something important about what the best remote-first employers actually look like in practice. Buffer builds social media management tools. They have been fully remote since their inception in 2010, and they moved to a 4-day workweek in 2020, making it a permanent fixture shortly after. But what makes Buffer genuinely stand out and what makes it worth knowing about beyond just job opportunities is their radical commitment to transparency. Buffer publishes their salaries publicly. Every employee, every role, every level. You can look it up. They publish their revenue, their equity framework, their diversity data, and their internal equity formula. In an industry where salary opacity is the norm and negotiating from a position of information asymmetry is standard, Buffer's approach is a model of what a fair, trust-based employer can look like. They have a small but globally distributed teams, and they hire across product, engineering, data, marketing, and customer advocacy functions, meaning this is another company on the list that is not restricted to technical roles. For Caribbean and Latin American professionals who have experienced the opacity and inequity of local hiring, where salaries are not discussed, where negotiating is uncomfortable, where the information advantage sits entirely with the employer, Buffer's model is genuinely refreshing to encounter. And this also goes for those of us who have been in remote work for a while and know that salary is such a gray area. What to expect? Transparent and published salary bands, a 4-day work week, a strong async communication culture, and a company small enough that your contributions are genuinely visible. Where to apply? buffer.com/journey. One thing worth naming directly about every company on today's list, they are all US headquartered or US centric in their operating culture. And that means written English is not just a requirement. It is the medium through which your entire professional identity is communicated internally. Every Slack message, every document, every asynchronous update, every performance review is written. There's no body language, no vocal tone, no in-person relationship to fall back on when the words aren't quite right. For Caribbean professionals, many of whom are already native English speakers, this is a genuine structural advantage, but it's worth being intentional about. The standard these companies are evaluating you against isn't conversational English. It's precise, professional, business-level written communication. Before you apply, audit your written presence. Look at your cover letter, your LinkedIn summary, your portfolio descriptions. Read them as a recruiter in San Francisco or New York would. If there are gaps, close them first. Tools like Grammarly, Claude, and ChatGPT can help you refine your writing before it reaches a hiring manager. This is one of the lowest cost, highest return investments you can make in your remote job search. Before I close, let me give you 3 practical principles for approaching any of these companies, because knowing they exist and successfully landing a role with them are 2 different things. First, research their culture before you apply. Every company on this list has publicly available documentation about how they work. Handbooks, blog posts, culture pages, public salary frameworks. Read them. Candidates who understand the company's actual operating model before the interview stand out immediately from those who've only read the job description. Second, demonstrate async communication competence from the first contact. In a distributed company, how you communicate is your work. Every email, cover letter, and message you send is an audition for how you'll show up as a team member. Be clear, be specific, be structured. Reference the company's own language back to them. Show that you've done the reading. Third, apply even when you feel uncertain. Several of these companies, Automattic, Superside, SafetyWing, have hired people from the Caribbean and Latin America successfully. The precedent exists. The infrastructure for paying you, employing you, and supporting you across borders exists. The remaining barrier is largely one of visibility and confidence. You are eligible. Apply accordingly. We started this series with a conversation that I think about often. Oshida Christie said something that has stayed with me. The goal isn't just to get a remote job. It's to stop surviving and start living. To stay home, stay whole, and build something that actually reflects what you're worth. That's what this trilogy has been about. Episode 1 gave you the mindset and the strategy. Episode 2 gave you the map where the jobs live and how to find the ones that are genuinely open to you. And today, we went deeper. 7 companies with the culture, the infrastructure, and the hiring philosophy were built for people like us, wherever we are on the map. The pipeline is clear. The resources are real. What stands between you and a remote career isn't geography. It's preparation and consistency. If you're ready to move with both, Curivo is where I'd point you. Oshido and his team have built something specifically for Caribbean professionals. The strategy, the tools, and the system to get you there in 90 days or less. You can find them at curivo.co. All 7 companies from today's episode, along with every resource from this series, are linked in the show notes. And you can also check out theremoteIslander.com for all the information. Thank you for being a remote islander. Keep going, stay grounded, stay global. Later, Remote Islanders.